here we go. Here we go. So let's start with the what is my grade question. And as always, I will refer you to the syllabus because, you know, it's our rule book. So let me go to the page that talks about grades. It's been on one page. There we go. That's so small. Can you see it? Okay. All right. So scroll up a little. So we have the whole grading system thing. So it's on the second page of the syllabus. So, and just kind of a reminder, you're supposed to come to Zoom meetings, but you're here, so I don't need to tell you. The free book link doesn't work as well anymore, but I've sent you an update on that grading system. So, weekly assignments, 10 points per chapter, and then a quiz worth 40 points per unit. So the whole total is 300 points. You also have to do a book review if you would like to get an A, because I know, I mean, I'm not great at math, but I know it is possible to get 300 points without the book review, but it's not possible to get an A without the book review, okay? So you have 30 points built in that you can miss and still, as long as you do the book review, get an A, which clearly several of you are interested in. The book review can add up to 20 points to your grade. So that's a possible extra 20 points. So if you were just the perfect student, you can end up with a point total of 320, which, you know, then maybe you could sell your extra points to people, but you can't. Don't do that. Okay. So the B range is 240 to 269. So it's 29, 30 point range within. The magic number for you to make sure you pass is 210 total. Now, please don't turn in everything late. A couple of late assignments. And by late assignments, I don't mean like every weekly question counts as one, you know, turn in the stuff on time. I'm not going to be like a jerk to you about the late assignments. However, well, maybe I will be. It's up to you to decide if I'm a jerk or not me. But, you know, if it's 30 minutes late or, you know, you turn in 3 weekly questions late or maybe all 4, I'm not going to say, well, that's too bad, you flunk. But on those last assignments, the ones that are due on a Friday and then my grades are due on a Tuesday, don't even consider turning everything in that week on that Tuesday. That's not gonna be cool, okay? And book review, I guess we probably should talk about the book review a little bit too, because that's, yeah, that's due relatively soon. So on the book review, there's an outline of the book review, what you're supposed to do for the book review. I don't think I attached it to the syllabus. Sorry, that's why I was scrolling. But the point totals I put in the announcement. So keep referring to those. And honestly, almost anything that you need to know about grades is covered in that section. I am not telling you you can't ask me questions because I'll still probably answer them, probably. However, all the details really are in the syllabus. They're pretty serious about that when you go to work for a college. They really want the syllabus to be very complete. I was reading something where somebody said, a fellow history teacher said that his favorite professor had a syllabus that was 100 pages long because it was so specific. It's like, yeah, I'm not that specific. This is long enough. But the grade section is, I think, relatively clear, okay? On the book reviews, I'm just gonna say this again. This plagiarism thing is not good, okay? So when you do the book review, make sure it's completely your work. Don't find one online and copy it and paste it in there, because that'll get you a failing grade for the course, not just on the book review. So be really careful about that. That's typically the biggest problem that I have with book reviews. Also, some of you are asking, what am I supposed to do in this section of the book review? Is what I'm doing okay? If you finish your book review early enough, you can send it to me and I'll give you some general feedback, okay? But early enough doesn't mean it's due Monday, November 30th, so you send it to me Sunday, November 29th. You know, it would mean at least a couple of days ahead of time. It needs to be enough time for me to read it, get the information back to you, and for you to revise it. Also, I would strongly suggest to you not to share it with me for feedback if you don't intend to change it based on my feedback, because honestly, it'll kind of irritate me if you ask me for my opinion about it, because I am the person who's grading it, and then I give you my opinion and then you go like, yeah, I don't care. That would be annoying to me. So, all right. I can't remember. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling down to see if okay, book review. All right. There's a bunch of you are asking, like, what am I supposed to do in the book review? This is what you're supposed to do in the book review. So there's a form that's designated in the book review. So please make sure you follow this format. Now, on the is it double-spaced, what size font, I don't care about any of that. But please give me a word count. That would be helpful for me so I don't have to figure that out on my own. But you're looking for 1,500 typewritten words. And for normal sized font word processing program sort of thing, that's probably 4 to 5 pages. So it's not double spaced. I'm not saying it has to be double spaced. I'm just saying that if it is, it's typically 4 to 5 pages. So pretty standard short-ish paper. I don't know how many papers you've written, but that's short-ish for like history papers. The first section should be the shortest, really super brief outline of the book. The second and third sections, like I think the first section should be about a page long. The second section should be about 2 pages, and the third section should be about 2 pages. And the first section, make sure in the first paragraph you say the name of the book and the name of the author, okay? Just start off with that, you know. Just make sure you say it in that first paragraph. Otherwise, it's sort of odd if you start talking about a book, but you don't tell me what the book is. I know it's in the title, but you're still supposed to say it. So say it. Don't be shy. Just say it. So part 1, super brief outline, a little bit more than a table of contents kind of thing, but not a typical book report sort of thing, because that's not what this is. So let's say that you wrote or you read a book about General Patton. So maybe your part 1, you would say like the name of the book that I read was Patton the Ultimate Warrior by George Marshall, who probably wouldn't have written that book, but and then you say like they served together in the army, so he was an expert on that, and he starts off in the first 4 chapters by talking about Patton's childhood, where he grew up in Virginia, and I don't remember. But and he had a couple brothers and sisters, and his dad was an auto mechanic. That's not true. And then you say like part 2 of the book is chapters 6 through 10, where it talks about his time at Virginia Military Institute and then at West Point, and talks about the difficulties he had at school because he was dyslexic. And then part 3 of the book was chapters 11 through 15. And it was about Patton's military career and family life and, you know, some basic stuff about it. And part 2 is where you tell me why the author wrote the book. On a biography, you want to tell me why they decided that person was the person they needed to write a book about. Why is that person more important than any other person in the world they could have written about? This is also where it's very important for you to look in the introduction or the foreword section of the book, because typically a history writer will, and other writers do the same thing, will tell you why they wrote the book in that first, you know, in that introduction or foreword. And sometimes a historian will tell you their actual thesis there. So that's kind of useful. So make sure you look at that. And then the rest of part 2 is you showing me if you think the author prove the thesis. So if the patent thesis was Patton was well prepared and became the best general in American history. So then you would take out some stuff. Can you hear the trash trucks behind you? They're so loud. They're not in my house. They're in the front of the house. But you know, for the first section of the patent book, you would pull out stuff from his childhood or his education that showed how prepared he was. And then the second part would show how crucial he was in World War II. And you would quote that and you would put the page number, that sort of thing. And not like super long quotes. I don't want paragraphs or anything, but a sentence or two, or even smaller is fine. But you do want to quote from the book, especially in section 2, and you want to quote from more than one section of the book. I think the biggest concern I have about people's book reviews here is sometimes they will quote all from the beginning of the book or all from the end of the book, and then I'm left with the thought, why didn't you read the middle of the book? So make sure you have some quotes from throughout the entire book, okay? And then part 3 is, oh, and with those quotes, you're going to tell me, do you think he established, or she established, the thesis of the book? Was Patton really well prepared and the most important general in U.S. history? And then part 3 is your evaluation. Did you like it? Did you not like it? Would you recommend it to other people? Did you detect any bias in the author? And you don't have to deal with that if you're not sure. That's fine. But to detect a bias in the author, you got to know something about the author. So you might do just a little random search about the author, where they went to college, what the background was, that sort of thing. And that may give you some clues. And you may want to do that before you read the book. You know, so it'll give you some clues about what the author was thinking and where they grew up and where they went to college and that sort of thing, what their job was, because that influences sometimes what they write about. You agree or disagree with the book conclusion, and also how does it compare to what is in the textbook about that subject. Now, they're not going to be, if you read a Patton book, there aren't going to be a whole lot of pages in the textbook about Patton. However, there are going to be lots of things in the book about things Patton was involved in. So make sure you look those up in the index and talk about those things. Okay. And also, how does this add to your knowledge of that person or subject? You know, what did you learn in this book that you didn't know before? And then, of course, at the end, would you recommend it to other people? And be as honest as you can, but be more specific and more academic than saying it was boring, no one should read it. You can think the book was boring, and that's completely fine. Just find a different way to talk about it. You know, whatever it was that made it boring to you, like maybe it talked too much about his time at West Point, or maybe you got too much information about his childhood and his family. You could say, I would have preferred less information about his childhood and more information about his career. So that's a better criticism than it's boring. Occasionally I'll have somebody say it was poorly written. I remember one student in particular wrote that their book was poorly written and it had won the Pulitzer Prize. So the fact that you think it's poorly written, if someone gave it the Pulitzer Prize, somebody's opinion may have outranked yours on that one. So again, you know, if you think it's poorly written, just say what you didn't like about the writing. Maybe you thought the vocabulary was too academic, so it wasn't as approachable. It was hard to read. You can say that. That's completely fair. But poorly written or boring, those aren't as good. Okay. So I'll give you a yes or no as far as, you know, do you get the credit for writing the book review? And does it count toward your attempt to get an A? And then you'll get points somewhere between 1 and 20. The only reason you wouldn't get points is if I think you plagiarized. And if I think you plagiarized, I will put in the comments, here's where I think you got your information from. Now, even if you didn't get your information from that source, if it is word for word the same as that source, because I've had students tell me like, well, that's not where I got that information. Well, it just means you got it from somewhere else that copied that information. If it's word for word, like something else that I found online, you did not write it. Okay, so make sure, please don't do that, because that is my least comfortable conversation ever with any student, is the plagiarism conversation. And you can deny it all day, but if it's word for word online the same as something else, there's, I got, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So make sure, you know what I'm saying, make sure that your work is your own work. That's what I want anyway. I don't want a professional historian's work. I can find that online too. And you don't have to do a book from this list. I am going to suggest to you, if you're in a spot where right now it's like, oh crap, I really need the 20 points, but I haven't picked a book. What could I read that's really fast? All right, here we go. I almost always suggest a couple of books on here if you're in a, oh crap, I need to read something, but I don't have a lot of time mode. And they may or may not be the best books ever. I don't know. I mean, that's up to you, but they tend to go fairly quickly. Black Like Me, there are huge problems with this book, which will give you a lot to talk about in the third section. But this is the journalist who's a white guy, lives in Dallas, Mansfield, I think. Writes for Black magazine Sepia and wants to report on how white people treat Black people when nobody's looking, but he can't get any information about it. Now, certainly African Americans have written about this, but another thing you can talk about in the third section, apparently their credibility is suspect because they're Black. So white guy pretends to be a Black guy, goes undercover and writes about how whites treat Blacks when nobody's looking. It's a weird book. It's an interesting book. I know it's cultural appropriation. I get it. I mean, there are huge problems with this book, but it's an interesting book. So, and it also talks about how when he publishes his articles, he ends up leaving the country because people want to kill him. So the reaction is pretty stunning. So might be something worth looking at. The reason that I recommend it is it reads really quickly. So this is your emergency book. Understanding there are lots of problems with it. But there aren't really historical problems with it. Like, he's not making stuff up. I don't mean that. I mean that there are cultural issues with it. I get that. Sorry, I'm all scratchy in my throat. All But My Life goes pretty quickly. That's the lady who was rescued from a concentration camp by a US soldier and ends up marrying him. Tricky part about that is focusing more on the historical part of it than the personal part of it, but the reading will go pretty quickly. I'm so sorry. Oh. This book, if you like boxing, it's interesting, kind of. This is about the Ali Frazier fights. I know you're going like, really? But it also talks about the politics behind it. It's written by a sports writer. So it's not a traditional history book, but it reveals a lot about how people took sides in Ali Frazier. The people who were much more conservative and lots of times incredibly racist wanted Joe Frazier to win these fights. The people who were anti-war, excuse me, tended to favor Ali. And there's a backdrop in there, but you know, the clash between the two of them physically, personally. Also, you get the Nation of Islam in there and their influence. So, and Muhammad Ali was converted to Islam by Malcolm X. So there's that backdrop in there. It's an interesting book. It's also really short and reads quickly. Oh my, I am so sorry. And then the last one that students read a lot is this one. Linda Van Deventer, Home Before Morning. And it's exactly what it says. It's a story of an Army nurse in Vietnam. And it is incredibly depressing, as you might imagine, but reads pretty quickly. She is super gung-ho about Vietnam, like go team, defeat communists, defeat them over there before they come over here, and volunteers to save the world. And because she loves the United States, which saving the world and loving the United States are great things. And then it devolves pretty quickly, and her life gets pretty messed up. And she talks about that too. It's a rough book, but it also goes quick. All right, and then there's How I Grade It, which is pretty basic stuff. So, all right, check to see if you've typed anything in the chat. Doesn't look like it. So that's grades and the other thing, book review. All right. And you have questions, weekly questions due by Friday. And you also have the quiz, which I think I finally figured out how to program it where it actually comes up when it's supposed to. So hopefully I got that right for the first time in about 7 tries. Also, a couple of you last time told me that when you took the quiz, a couple of the questions came up and they just had answers. They didn't have a question. I only heard that from 1 or 2 people. So I'm not saying that, you know, you weren't telling the truth. I'm sure you were. But if there's something like that, I need to know from everyone who sees it so that I can go in and maybe fix it. If I don't hear from more than 1 or 2 people, I'm going to think it's a technology issue on your end. I'm not saying that we won't try to solve it in some way. I'm just saying the fix is going to be different depending on if it's a systemic issue, like it's a problem with how I put it in, or if it's a problem with how it was received on your end. Does that make sense? Maybe. I don't know. All right. Let's see if I can talk to you about history now without coughing. I'm not very convinced. I'm trying to turn the temperature down in my house from my phone. See if maybe it's cooler, I'll do better. I know you needed to know that, by the way. Yeah. Well, if you guys are all telling each other, you have to tell me that. I think I heard from like 2 or 3 people in an email, and you might have told me in the chat or something, but I'm old, so I forget stuff. So yeah, if that happens, let me know. Yeah, because I really do want to fix it. I don't want you guys to struggle with figuring out what I'm asking. Okay. All right. I'll go back and check your email. I'll make a note of that. I think I had to check someone else's last week. I think I actually checked theirs though. So sorry. You would be surprised how many emails I got. So I know you're the same way right now. So I'll go back and check. Also, I will always say to you that even if you've asked me once or twice already, feel free to ask me a 3rd time, because I won't, think that you're being annoying. I think that you're being persistent and that I overlooked your email. So feel free to send it more than once. Okay. All right, let's look at today's stuff. Maybe. All right, I think we finished the 60s-ish, or not 60s, the 50s. And are ready for chapter 25, which is the 60s. Dang, the 60s. 60s probably the most important decade in US history. Why is that? You know why, because I was born in the 60s. That's it. The book, are you talking, buying the book, you're talking book review book or online? Or yeah, I don't care. If you can find it online, and it's a PDF or something, that's cool. The only issue for that sometimes is how you document what page you found the information on. But, just however it is in the source that you're looking at, just document it that way. And if you need to explain that in an email or in a like forward as part of your book review, that's fine too. So, all right. So here we go. Oh, I'm so sorry. So the 60s were important not just because I was born in the 60s and my older brother and my younger brother, which, you know, the fine decade, 3 people from my family were born. But there's so much stuff going on in the 60s. Now, the 60s, I think you look back at the 60s and you see lots of hope and lots of promise, but also lots of really depressing stuff. So the 60s is a very hard decade for the country, in spite of 3 members of my family being added, you know, to the country. So, and several other cousins as well. Civil rights movement kind of gets a foothold and starts to become a little more accepted and then a little more radical. And you see really kind of a split between the northern and southern version of the civil rights movement a little bit. Then you see the southern version of the civil rights movement becoming more aggressive, more assertive, in part because of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They're fairly nonviolent. I'm not suggesting that they're not, but they're also quite a bit less patient than the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Dr. King and Reverend Vivian, that group of folks who, you know, they tend to be a little more conservative because their political goals are slightly different. But lots of civil rights protests that we'll talk about. Also, we've got Kennedy as president, who shows a lot of promise, probably doesn't fulfill a lot of that promise, my opinion, and then gets assassinated. So then we kind of make, you know, when we have a president who gets assassinated, their memory becomes probably better than their actual record. So then he's replaced by LBJ, who does a lot of the things that we credit JFK for, plus get a whole bunch of people involved in Vietnam, which is, you know, will mess with your reputation. If you send 500,000 people to a foreign war, people will notice that, and they may or may not be okay with that. And then LBJ's presidency, toward the end of the one term that he wins, we get mired down in Vietnam. You have that really tumultuous year of 1968, where he decides he just can't deal with it anymore. It's not exactly what he decides, but he decides he's not going to run for re-election. And then we get Nixon out of the deal, which is kind of interesting as well. So lots of stuff to talk about here. Plus, oh yeah, court cases. Yeah. And the civil rights movement expands beyond what you think of as the typical black and white civil rights movement. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in here. So let's at least see if we can get through Kennedy and into LBJ today. And sorry for the super long intro about all the other stuff that's not really related to the chapter. Okay, and your weekly question is, did we expand freedom, equality, some general thing like that, or not? And of course the answer will be yes and no, as it often is with those kind of questions. So civil rights movement now is really pushing to make sure it's on the news. So public awareness and also nonviolent, at least on the surface. I think we've talked a little bit about how a lot of the dads, the civil rights dads, because a lot of this was a youth movement, high school and college kids, and they were profoundly nonviolent. They're going to change the world. You know how optimistic you are when you're that age, and some of you are still that age. It's like, I will change the world. I remember that in my first teaching job, and then someone pulled a knife on me. It's like, I don't know if I will change the world. So, you know, reality hits you sometimes at the end of a knife, or when you get to a wall, which also happened in one of my first teaching jobs, or sometimes you could change the world, and probably both of those things are true. But the young folks, it's like, yes, we can do this. If we show peace and love, everyone will change. And the dads are on the roofs with their sniper rifles. So, and they literally were in some instances. You could find books about that too. That would be interesting. There's trying to think of the movie that I watched. It was an HBO movie. It was called Deacons for Defense. And I know it comes from a book. I never read the book. I hate to be just lazy like that, but it's true. I never read that book. But it talked about a group of deacons from a church whose kids were all involved in the civil rights movement, and they were just scared to death. They were from Bogalusa, Louisiana. And they were just scared to death that the KKK was going to kill their kids. So every time their kids went out to do these peaceful, nonviolent marches, which were led by some SNCC people from the north, and they were typically white guys who led the civil rights marches, who came down to the South, and the kids were typically black kids. The dads would just go on the roof with sniper rifles, and the people who coordinated the protest would get upset with the dads, and they go like, yeah, it doesn't matter, those aren't your kids, they're mine. And when they get killed, you didn't lose a kid, I lost a kid. So it's really kind of an interesting story, a true story. And they don't start talking about this until really about the 2000s, where people are getting toward the end of their lives. So they're going to start writing about it. They feel like they're past the amount of time, statute of limitations, where they're going to get prosecuted. So I don't know, kind of interesting stuff. There is I see in Amazon, the book is called The Deacons for Defense. It's Jonesboro, Louisiana. Jonesboro, Louisiana. But that sort of writing, this I think is also why people studying history always matters, because we continually discover memoirs and information like this that people worked pretty hard to cover up. And if you're wondering, like, why would they want to cover that up? They want to cover it up because you're not supposed to have a sniper rifle on the roof and shoot at people. In the Deep South, the police officers tended to be KKK members, sheriffs, police officers. Not, I'm not saying now, I'm saying back then. And a lot of times the elected officials were as well. So the KKK doesn't want the message to get out that they're getting shot at, that they're honestly losing some of these battles, if you will think of it that way, to a group of black men who are armed on rooftops. And then there'll be some times where they literally have like face-to-face fights. And nobody wants those on the news either, especially the civil rights movement, because they're supposed to be nonviolent. So there's all sorts of people who really want this covered up. So it's interesting that it takes 30 or 40 years before people are willing to talk about it and write about it. And I think that's often true in history, which is why sometimes you get revisions of history. I know my older relatives is like, can't you just tell history the way it really was? It's like, yeah, who decides the way it really was? And who tells the story? And sometimes parts of the story don't come out for a long time. So, okay, back to the notes. I know you're going like, can't you just, no, I get excited about this stuff. All right, so the main public part of the civil rights movement emphasized nonviolence. Gandhi, Niebuhr, and the training by Bayard Rustin, who's another guy you could read about. That was the guy that did all the summer trainings for civil rights, how to curl up in the ball and not get hurt, and also planned the March on Washington. He's also the guy that was openly gay. So he wasn't a public part of the civil rights movement because we just weren't openly gay in the 50s and 60s. So Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, notice that nonviolent part of their name, they just got a little impatient. So they're going to organize all of these sit-ins that you see at lunch counters. And what typically happens in those, if you have time to watch the Time for Justice video, you'll see it opens with some of those, some footage from some of those. What happens is African American students typically will go to lunch counters. I don't know, like, I don't know if we have lunch counters, but they used to have them in department stores during that time period. And you would go in, it was just like a bar service kind of thing without the alcohol, and you could get, you know, a soda or milkshake with a small lunch, like a diner lunch, a sandwich or a salad or soup or maybe a hamburger. But those were whites only. And if you were not white, you could order the food there, but you would have to take it out. You couldn't eat it there. So those kids, college kids, they weren't really kids, would go and sit at the lunch counter and order food. Now, by this point, it's 1960, you know, it's the 1960s. The Supreme Court has said it's time to desegregate everything. The South has said we're not doing that just yet. So these college kids said, yes, you are. So they went to these lunch counters. They also made sure that the press was there. And what would happen is people would come in off the streets, angry people who didn't think desegregation was a good idea. And as you're guessing, white people would come in and beat the crap out of them. And then they would get arrested for disturbing the peace. It's astonishing. It truly is. And you can see it on film if you like. And a lot of times too, the students who protested were, sometimes they were from the North, in part because they could leave. If you lived in the South and were Black, you probably didn't want to do this as much because you had to deal with the law enforcement. You lived there. The law enforcement guys were KKK members. If you had a family, they were going to harm your family. The students could come and go. I mean, they were going to get the crap beaten out of them, but then they could leave. So you saw lots of Quaker kind of students, ministerial sorts of students. You'll see the Catholic Church very involved in these kind of activities during this time period because they've really got a social justice theology during this era. So liberation theology is what they'll refer to it as. So lots of folks from the North come to the South, and then sometimes Black college students from the South will participate. And this is also the era where lots of those folks will get killed. Dr. King will come and lead some protests, and he'll get arrested. And he writes that very famous letter from a Birmingham jail, where a lot of the religious leaders in Birmingham, Alabama, wrote an editorial. They worked together on an editorial where they said that their community was completely peaceful until Dr. King came and stirred stuff up. And Dr. King said, that's not exactly how this worked. And of course, he said it more eloquently than that because that's who he was. But he said, until you've experienced the life we've experienced, you would never call this peaceful. And he says it much better, of course. And again, I would highly recommend that video to you, but I know sometimes your life is full. A March on Washington in '63, which culminates with the I Have a Dream speech, is probably the high point of the early part of the movement, and it also leads to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So both of those things are super important. Voting Rights Act will get rid of literacy test. We'll have an amendment to get rid of the poll tax. The Voting Rights Act will also take voter registration out of the hands of state and local authorities and make it a federal situation. And my guess is after this current election, you may see some other things become more federal than local, as far as procedures on ballot counting, that sort of thing. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know, just predicting. But I am not suggesting that it's the same issue as the voter registration issue. If you study that very specifically, you will notice they didn't have a standardized process for voter registration. So they would give African Americans a different process test than they would give white people. Like Rosa Parks, I know I've probably mentioned before, failed her voter registration test 3 times, educated woman, and she passed the last time because she had a lawyer with her observing while she took it. Even if you passed it, they could say you failed it, they could lose your application. A lot of times the voter registrars knew that this SNCC group was sending a bunch of people to register, and they would just close the office and not come back. So there were all kinds of sketchy things going on with voter registration in the South, and they would reject their IDs and that sort of thing. So civil rights protests in more than 185 cities in 1963 with several goals. One, getting arrested, which sounds weird, but you know, it's going to get noticed more if you get arrested, and making the news. And they wanted to be nonviolent to contrast their methods to the people who opposed them. Because if you look at some of the footage from that time period, you will see law enforcement beating the daylights out of the marchers. You will see them sending attack dogs on them. You'll see them attacking them with water hoses. And I remember going to a conference about civil rights movement in the Deep South. It was in Alabama. It was a really fascinating thing to do, and really kind of weird as well. I remember because we walked over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is, you know, a very cool experience as a history teacher. And then on the other side, there's a little memorial to John L. Lewis, and a monument. It wasn't, you know, John L. Lewis was still alive then, because he had just passed this year, and other folks who walked over. Excuse me. And we got to meet a couple of the folks who walked over as well. But then right above that memorial, there was a sign that said, "The United Klans of Alabama welcome you to Selma." It's like, oh my gosh. So, I mean, but that was, you know, I doubt that sign is still there. I'm trying to remember when I went. It must have been early 2000s. So, I mean, it wasn't a million years ago, but still, it was 21st century. But they did want to make sure they made the news. Back to this, so sorry. And they wanted to be publicized. And they wanted, I was going to tell, I'm sorry. Part of that meeting, we met police officers who talked about the training that they had and how to most likely injure the civil rights protesters, especially with those water hoses. Because I know especially when I taught high school, sometimes the kids would say like, what is it getting hit with a hose? But the firefighting hoses, that is some high pressure stuff. I mean, high pressure enough to put out a fire. It can easily break your arms or your legs, which is what the police officers talked about. You know, they knew where to point the hose stream to make sure that they were more likely to cause a permanent injury. So it was fascinating, rough, terrible. Yeah. I don't know. It's a really good thing to do as a history teacher. Really terrible thing to have lived through. I'm certain of it. Leaders of the movement contrasted their methods to those who opposed them, and that's part of what appealed to the average white person in the North who would push for legislation to make changes. And remembering, too, that there's a bigger population in the North than the South, and also what the Southern protesters especially wanted was the federal government to start enforcing 14th Amendment, other laws that would protect them. And at this point, the federal government was just saying like, we'll let the South take care of it. And we all know how that worked. So JFK gets elected 1960, takes office in 61. And there's a lot of hope that he'll bring in lots of change, that sort of thing. But he also has to deal with some fairly serious foreign policy issues, two of them relating to Cuba. So we have a little discussion of those two things, the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the things that we were most concerned about, I wasn't here or voting just yet, but people were most concerned about with Kennedy was that he didn't have a lot of experience in foreign policy. So they weren't sure, even though he was clearly bullish against communists, everyone was, no one liked the communists. They weren't sure how he would manage foreign policy. They thought people would feel like they could push him around a little bit. So Bay of Pigs, we had a U-2 spy plane fly over. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm mixing this up. The Bay of Pigs, apologies. This is right after Castro's revolution. This was a plan drawn up by the Eisenhower administration, and the plan was to train Cuban refugees and have a few CIA people in with them as well. They did the training. I think they did the training in Nicaragua. And then drop them off at the beach and the Bay of Pigs, and then provide air support from the US military to help them, you know, charge into Havana and then lead a revolution to overthrow Castro. And we wanted to make it look more indigenous and organic. So when JFK became president, he inherits this plan. Doesn't mean he has to follow through on it, but he wants to look tough on communism. So he's okay with the plan, but he thinks, you know, this won't look very indigenous if we have air support from the US military, because it'll be fairly obvious. So we drop off about 1,500 folks on the beach and they all get captured or killed. And no air support, you know, they don't get popular support. People aren't going to rise up against Castro at that point, or honestly, ever, I suppose, because it's hard to overthrow someone in power, and it's also hard to set up a new government, that sort of thing. So, and it's deadly as well. If you lose, you're going to be killed. So this made JFK look like he didn't plan well, made him look weak and ineffective. He goes on television and says, "I'm not sorry we did it, I'm just sorry it didn't work." He says it in a better way, of course. And he's also supposed to have peace talks with Khrushchev that year. They were supposed to be with Eisenhower the year before, but Khrushchev knew Eisenhower's not going to be in power the next year. Plus, we had a spy plane that got shot down over the Soviet Union. And so Khrushchev says, "I can't believe you people are spying on us. That's just wrong." Of course, we were both spying on each other. "I don't even want to talk to Eisenhower. I'll just talk to the next president." So JFK goes over to the Brandenburg Gate, over to West Berlin, and he gives a speech where he says, "I'm a Berliner," which apparently might have meant a jelly donut, might not have meant a jelly donut. But he says, you know, the whole world is with you, and then promises to spend like $2 billion on defense. So then Khrushchev says, "What's the point of having talks with you?" So he cancels the talks and says, "Let's build a wall." And that's when they build the Berlin Wall. So by the end of '61, the Soviet Union builds the wall in Berlin to stem the tide of immigrants from east to west. And protesting JFK's promise to spend more on defense. And then the United States says, you know, we have to improve our reputation throughout the world. So we create these two agencies, the Peace Corps and the Alliance for Progress. And that's certainly something, you know, if you ever think, what did Kennedy do that was beneficial? These things might have been beneficial. I think we roundly appreciate the Peace Corps. These are usually college graduate type folks that we send overseas to do nice things, work in schools, to help build water supplies, that sort of thing, you know, to just generally build up infrastructure, programs, health clinics, that kind of thing, and to help groups of people who are already within, you know, part of that country, you know, to provide and assist. Alliance for Progress is businesses who agree to do similar things, but they can bring in lots of equipment to really make differences quickly. So, you know, they can they can bring in construction equipment to build a hospital, to create a water system, that sort of thing, to build an electrical grid. So Alliance for Progress is big time corporate version of help. US Peace Corps is individual college kid version of help. And both of these things are supposed to show the rest of the world, all right, somebody's talking about the donut thing. Very nice. But these things are supposed to make us look like not conquering heroes or defeaters of communism, but, you know, the people that we truly are, well, I mean, we're probably both, to be fair, but you know, the people that just want to help you and make your life better. And I know some of you go like, yeah, we're not like that. Sure we are. We're both of those things from time to time. And certainly anyone who joins the Peace Corps, they're not trying to dominate the world. They're trying to help. Now, I know some of you are going, well, again, cultural appropriation, and we're wanting to spread our Americanness throughout the world, maybe, and maybe we're just wanting to make sure people have clean water. It's probably some of you. I get it. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Okay, I figured the German professors would know the most about it. I remember listening to someone who talked about how a Berliner could be a person, but in certain areas of Germany, it referred to a certain type of donut, and always a grammar issue. And it's also why I try not to speak Spanish in front of people, because it won't come out well. Usually, have to at soccer or school on occasion. My husband was a Spanish teacher. He would just look at me when I would try, and it's like, yeah, I'm sorry. I did my best. Yeah, hola, I can do that. There's some other tiro de esquina, corner kick. I've learned some soccer Spanish, and I know what they're calling the referees from time to time. Okay, back to business. The important Spanish. I do remember the first day I taught at a school that was like 98% Spanish speaking, one of my early jobs. And my husband, he was super smart guy and super nice, and we were very different. I'm not saying I'm not nice. We're a different kind of nice. But he said, honey, you had some Spanish in college, and that's wonderful. But there's some words you never learned, and I need to teach you those. So we had a cuss word lesson the day before I taught at that school. And the first things a kid said to me in Spanish, which I won't repeat here, was definitely something that I learned the day before. So it was important. So kids, what are you going to do? All right. Kennedy on civil rights. We should talk about that. Oh, sorry, Cuban Missile Crisis. We didn't talk about that. That's fairly important as well. So we should definitely talk about that. So Cuban Missile Crisis, you got to remember, JFK has already looked a little foolish with the Bay of Pigs. So he knows if there's another conflict, he's got to look tough. We send a U-2 spy plane over Cuba, which we do with some regularity. And they notice that we're putting in, or that, excuse me, the Soviets are putting in some nuclear missile silos. Well, Cuba's fairly close to Florida, and this is a problem. They're going to have nuclear weapons 90 miles from Florida. So, there are lots of ways you could handle this. You call Khrushchev and say, what the heck are you doing? You could go through diplomatic channels, or you could do what JFK did. You could go on television and say, hey, we noticed they got nuclear missile silos in Cuba, and dang Soviets, you better take those out, or we will respond with the full force of the US military. Wow, you could do that. That probably won't lead to the most peaceful reaction, and it didn't. The Soviet Union sent their nuclear subs toward, and their navy toward Cuba. We sent ours toward Cuba. It's not a good time to be in Cuba. And behind the scenes, we negotiate. Mostly Robert Kennedy is doing the negotiations on our side. And so the United States and the Soviet Union are negotiating behind the scenes. Publicly, they're threatening each other. So both Khrushchev and Kennedy are going on television like, we will kill you, no, we will kill you. Behind the scenes, what we're negotiating about is not us, of course, but NATO has nuclear weapons in Turkey, which is fairly close to the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union says, hey, how about you take those missiles out of Turkey, and we'll take those missiles out of Cuba. And we say like, hey, we don't have any missiles in Turkey. And they show us pictures and they go like, yeah, those aren't ours, those are NATO's. And then they go like, yeah, shut up, just take them out. Of course, this isn't exactly what any of them said. I know that you know that. So we said, hey, here's the deal. We will take the missiles that we never claim to have and will never admit to having out of Turkey if you will publicly take the missiles out of Cuba. And they go like, yeah, we don't care, we'll do that. But you have to promise publicly that you'll never invade Cuba. And he goes like, yeah, that's cool. So Kennedy promises that he'll never publicly invade Cuba. We very privately take the missiles that we don't acknowledge out of Turkey, and then Khrushchev very publicly takes the missiles out of Cuba. A couple things happen here. Some of you are going like, well, doesn't that make Khrushchev look weak? Heck no, because who controls the press in the Soviet Union? The state. So if anybody writes anything bad about Khrushchev, Khrushchev will just have him killed. I know he's the kinder, gentler version of Stalin, but no, not exactly. Not completely. I mean, he doesn't kill as many people, but he'll still kill you. So Khrushchev knows he doesn't have to worry about what's written in the press. Kennedy, any American president, has to worry about that a little, although not as much then as you do now, because Kennedy's doing some stuff he, probably shouldn't be doing. We'll talk about that in a little bit. That doesn't ever make the press, and certainly the press knows about it. But Kennedy's going to look tough to the U.S. press. Khrushchev doesn't have to worry about how he looks to the Soviet press. And some of you are going like, well, don't they get press from somewhere else? No, it'd be hard. And if they do, they're not telling anybody about it, and they're not getting in the Soviet Union. So, oh, goodness, now that place is pretty locked down. Kind of the way China is a little bit now, yeah, maybe. So this works out pretty well for Kennedy, makes him look tougher. The Soviet Union maybe looks a little weaker on the world stage, but not within the Soviet Union. This also sends a message to Castro in Cuba, and the message is both sides would be willing to blow your country off the face of the earth to get what they wanted. So then Castro realizes, even though he needs stuff, material, war stuff, maybe economic stuff from the Soviet Union, that they're really not his best buddy, that he's a pawn for them in this Cold War. So he doesn't want his country to become the next Korea or Vietnam. So he's going to tread a little more lightly because he doesn't want his country nuked. So kind of an interesting development there. It lasts for about 13 days, hence the name of the movie, 13 Days. That's also probably the closest we ever got to nuclear war. I remember I had a botany professor. I'll tell you why I took botany, because I thought it'd be easier than some other science class that I didn't take. Plus, my brother took it and did really well, but my brother's also a science guy. Yeah, I didn't do as well. But anyway, the botany professor said that I think he was in college in Florida at the time, and for some reason they took a boat trip during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he said they fell asleep on their boat, and when they woke up, they were surrounded by the U.S. Navy, who escorted them somewhere else. He said, yeah, we were floating around in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I thought, well, see, history, politics, it does matter. Mr. Botany, he was really smart. All right. If you're wondering, end result of this, does this make us better with the Soviet Union? It makes us a little different. We decide that this threatening each other publicly is probably not the best way to go. So we're going to install a hotline, a direct phone. I think they called it the red phone at the White House, but a direct line of communication between the Kremlin, the residence of the Soviet premier, and the White House. So that way we could threaten each other over the phone rather than in the press. It doesn't lead to negotiations. It really doesn't lead to a much more peaceful relationship, but it does lead to a less volatile public relationship, which is something. That's also when we saw a lot of bomb shelters during that time period. And the people in Florida, I remember, I was not alive yet in '62. So we're getting close, but I do remember looking at news stories where people were boarding up their places with plywood, like it was going to be a giant hurricane or something. So and buying canned food. So they prepare for nuclear holocaust the same way they prepare for hurricane, which is, it's how we prepare for anything, isn't it? You stockpile gas and apparently in the modern era, toilet paper, canned goods, and you put plywood on your windows. So it's like a duck and cover. It works for nuclear war and it works for tornadoes. Yeah. Okay. All right. It is how we prepared for the election too. I know that's not funny at all, but it is how we prepare for every crisis. Like plywood, canned goods, maybe toilet paper. I don't know. I did notice that the stores where I live they did run out of toilet paper, so maybe there's election toilet paper as well. So, oh no. Maybe we did go to the bathroom more because of the election. Okay, sorry, it's not that funny. All right. Um, JFK and civil rights. All right, and we probably should get closer to a point where we stop. Sorry, scrolling down to see. Yeah, if we get through. Yeah, okay. All right, sorry. So JFK's got the same problem every Democrat has when he runs for president. If he's too progressive on civil rights, the South will not vote for him. And remember, in spite of all the protests, African Americans are not voting in the South yet because, death. They don't want to get killed. So it's very dangerous for African Americans to vote in the South. So primarily in the South, the voters are white guys, and they primarily vote for, you know, not progressive civil rights stuff. They want to preserve segregation. So to have a Southern-Northern coalition for the Democrats is tricky. And I think, I'm not saying this about the Democrats in particular, I think we still see similar things. And it's not necessarily about civil rights, but it may be about North and South. It may be about country versus city. It may be about more religious and less religious, which I think is some of what you saw with Trump and Pence. With Biden and Harris, you see moderate versus not as moderate. So, there's always some major difference, but well, not always. I think with Clinton and Gore, you didn't see that much of a difference, my opinion. But in the modern era, you typically see some pretty stark differences between presidential candidate and the vice president. JFK picks LBJ because he's a Southern white dude who sounds like an old ranch hand that might be racist. He's not, but he sounds like it, and he's going to use some language that none of us would use. The cussing part, I know some of you probably swear, but the other words, there's a lot of tape of LBJ that's available online and at the LBJ library. I went to an LBJ library seminar one time, and they played a bunch of taped conversations between LBJ and Truman, the president before him, a couple before him, and it was pretty interesting and pretty he swore a lot, but anyway, JFK is super tentative on civil rights because he knows if he goes too far, he won't win the election. He's president when Wallace, George Wallace, who's the governor of Alabama, tries to prevent the desegregation of the University of Alabama by standing at the schoolhouse door, what he calls it, clearly the college entrance. That's an arranged photo op between Kennedy and Wallace, and they negotiated that because when they had tried to desegregate Ole Miss, they had to call in the National Guard, and people got shot and buildings got destroyed. And that was to get one black guy into a university of 30,000 white guys. So JFK says, we're going to do this again, but let's do it without the destruction. The governor of Alabama, George Wallace, says, yeah, I don't want destruction either. I just want my photo op because I promised my voters that I would resist desegregation, at risk of my life. And so they negotiated where he could stand at the door and they would point guns at him and not shoot him. And that's kind of the scene you see in Forrest Gump. But that's a weird photo op kind of thing. There are people within the administration that are frustrated with Kennedy because he's willing to negotiate these photo op kind of things. One of those people is his brother, Robert Kennedy, who's much more progressive on civil rights, which is, when he runs in '68, why people who are part of the civil rights movement are very excited about his candidacy. So this changes, though, after Martin Luther King Jr. gets arrested and you see the police brutality on the news night after night, and then JFK comes out in '63 and says, this is no longer a black and white issue. This is an American issue. This is a human issue. And it's an issue we have to solve now. Now, that's also the same year that he gets assassinated. I am not going to suggest that's why he got assassinated, because who knows? Who knows? Um, but he called for legislation to end racial discrimination, and in 63, and then he calls for that in the summer of 63, and then is assassinated in Dallas in 63. And we could talk about the assassination of JFK, but I don't know anything, other than just the story and the conspiracies. And you can go to the museum there; it's kind of interesting and depressing. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know. But when JFK gets assassinated, LBJ takes over. And the South, briefly is relieved because they go like, one of us is in there. And then they found out that one of us wasn't really one of them. So LBJ is going to be very forward thinking about civil rights and ending poverty. And so he'll sponsor the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. He's going to send federal protection to civil rights protesters. He's also going to take voter registration out of the hands of the local governments and the state governments and put it into the hands of the federal government, which is something that was reversed I think it was in the Trump administration. I'm sure that it was, because some southern states asked for that to be reversed. And that is one of the things I would expect to see changed back during the Biden administration. And I promise you, I'm not trying to talk about politics at all. I'm just, as it came up here, I'm not. All right, but LBJ will become president, and you will look at him and go like, that looks pretty good and that looks pretty bad. So LBJ has a really interesting and mixed record as a politician, as I guess politicians should, my opinion, because most of them will do some very good things and then some stupid things as well. I would make that assertion about pretty much every president we've had, even, the most recent one, and then some historical ones as well. All right. Okay. See if you had any chat issues. Okay, I think I'm going to stop recording here in the next minute or two, unless you guys have a question, because I want to take roll because I didn't, because I don't know why I didn't, but I. So, you guys have any questions before I stop the recording? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.